participants have had all participants have had their microphones muted and video turned off, but in a moment we'll explain how folks can interact with today's webinar. My name is Nicholas Ucci. I'm the Commissioner of the Office of Energy Resources. Again, really appreciate your attendance. I don't want to take longer than I need to, but there are a few folks that I want to acknowledge in the audience today, including Representatives Craven and Oyer. Thank you so much for being here. We also have fantastic representation from government and a lot of agencies that are critical to our long-term success for this project. And so I want to thank the Governor's Office, House and Senate policy staff, the Lieutenant Governor's Office, OER, the Division of Public Utilities and Carriers, DEM, PUC, DLT, DOH, Commerce. We have a whole alphabet soup of agencies on today, as well as representatives from local government, colleges and universities, the National Guard, and even the Oak Ridge National Laboratory. So some fantastic participation, along with all of you, just general members of the public who are interested in this topic. We have representatives from the renewable developer community, utilities, environmental advocates, and so many others. With that, I want to just right away turn it over to the Brattle Group so we can get going. And again, I want to apologize for the time we've lost while we're dealing with these audio issues. So I want to welcome Dean, Michael, and Jürgen. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. And Ellen, if we can step forward through our slides, I want to just highlight a couple of issues. So this presentation will be broken into two pieces. We'll have a short break in the middle. We'll have opportunities for Q&A both at the break and at the end. We'll be sort of tagged, the Brattle team will be tag teaming the presentation a little bit. If you've got questions, please submit them through the chat function, the Q&A function, which I believe you'll find a button at the bottom of your screen that will allow you to do that. So please send your questions and comments in. We'll also have a couple of opportunities throughout the presentation today where we'll present a couple of poll questions and get some quick responses from the audience. So let's move ahead, Ellen, who is kindly managing the presentation, all the way to our introductory slide, the Brattle Group's introductory slide. I will mention that this presentation deck will be posted on the web on OER's website shortly after this webinar concludes. There will also be, I believe, a link to the recording of this. That should also be in the same place. And if we can just step one more forward, Ellen. As we noted earlier, this webinar is being recorded. By default, all of the attendees, that is everyone but the panelists, will be muted and cameras off. Again, at the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A button. If you have a question, please type it into there. We will do our best to respond to it, either through that chat function or if there are particularly relevant questions. We've asked Carrie Gill to monitor the questions coming in. She will interrupt us and ask for a verbal response to any particular questions that seem of broad interest. If you're connected only by phone, you can press *9 to be recognized and allowed to speak during the Q&A periods. If you choose to do that, please identify yourself with your name and your organization. If anybody has any technical issues about the webinar logistics, if you're not able to connect well, if you're in the webinar, send a chat to Ellen Powell. She's the host of this. She's running the slides. And if you can't figure it out through that, just please send an email to ellenpowell@brattle.com. We'll have a roughly 10-minute break that'll probably occur at around 10:20. So if we can, go ahead, Ellen, step forward one slide. And I think we're going to start out by getting our poll system loaded up and see if people can begin to respond to this. We've got a couple of questions now that are just sort of, who are you and how familiar are you with this, with the energy system in Rhode Island? These will allow people to connect to the poll. You can see at the very top of your screen, if you can log in through a web browser, either on your phone or on your computer, to pollev.com/eresources411. There's a text coming through the chat function that has that address, and I see at least one person has already gotten in. So we're going to give a couple of minutes for people to connect to the poll and respond to this. We also do have the RSVP list, so we already have some idea of who at least responded to this. So we're starting to get enough results that we're seeing a number of representatives from state government, quite a number of people from industry, including vendors and developers, and perhaps other energy consultants. A number of customers, which I'm very glad to see, several from environmental organizations. And I'll invite either Carrie or Yasmin to let me know when you think we've got about most of the responses that we'll get. So we've got a total of over 60 responses so far, so at least most people have been able to connect. Okay,
thanks to everyone for their responses. It looks like results are slowing down, so I think that we can move on past this, but we do really appreciate everyone's input here. Helps us understand who's in the audience today, and that makes our presentation better and more responsive to you.
So this is great. I think we can, let's close this poll, Ellen, and move forward to the next one. And this is just to give us a sense of how familiar people are with the region's electricity systems. A lot of what we're going to say today requires some level of understanding of how the system works now, how it might work in the future, and the responses here will help us tune our presentation a little bit. See, a lot of people have some familiarity with the regional energy systems, and a few who have very little familiarity. Okay, as much as anything, this is telling me that people have figured out the poll and are able to respond to it, and I think that's a very good thing. We have a few questions coming later that we'll be very interested to get the group's input on as well. And Carrie, do you think we've got most of what we'll get at this point?
Yep, I think results are slowing down.
Okay, that's great.
Thank you.
Let's move ahead, Ellen, and we'll dive into the presentation. So our agenda for today, we'll start with a very brief recap of the previous workshop. This of course, is the second in a series of 3 workshops planned for this project. But then we'll dive into an updated outlook of 2030 load, and that's important because that defines how much renewable energy you need in order to reach 100%. We gave a preview of that last time. We've sharpened up the numbers on that a little bit, so we'll do a quick review on that and give you a sense of where we are. And then we really want to get into the meat of today's discussion, where we first will go through the renewable resource options that we are looking at and the costs of those various options. And that's sort of the resource acquisition costs, if you will, which is an important piece of the equation, but not the only piece. After that'll take us a little while to get through, and after that we'll take a brief break and an opportunity for some Q&A. And in the second half of today's webinar, we will talk about how we are characterizing the market value of the output of renewables and a little bit of insight about how that changes over time. We have an internal Brattle model that will model the New England market over time as it transitions from a primarily fossil-based market to a primarily renewable-based market. The implications that'll have for the actual operation of the system. And then we'll use the two pieces that we've identified, the renewable options and their costs, and the New England market characterization that allows us to understand the market value of those resources, and put them together to look at a couple of alternative portfolios. Right now, we have results for, or we have initial results for what we are terming bookend portfolios. So these are portfolios that consist entirely of one type of resource, recognizing that ultimately the portfolio that the state chooses will very likely be a blend of resource types. And we are sort of on the cusp of diving in and trying to develop attractive blended portfolios. But we think there's some valuable insights just from looking at those bookend portfolios and the results that are associated with those. One piece of the analysis that we haven't gotten into yet, it's in process right now, is the economic impact analysis. We'll say a little bit more about that later. And then we want to close with sort of where are we going in the next phase of this project, which is to develop policy recommendations that'll be informed by what we've done to date. We'll close with a final session for Q&A and allow people to comment, hopefully get some reactions. Okay, Ellen, we can move ahead. So you met the project team last time. I'll just say briefly, as Nick suggested, we are very well represented by Rhode Island state agencies, who we've listed the primary participants here. And then the consulting team, the Brattle Group, consists of myself, Jürgen Weiss, Mike Haggerty, you met all of us last time, and then we've added a member to our team, Kasparas Spokas, who has been helping us with the New England market model. So let's move ahead to our next slide. So the last time we were all together, back in July, we had a workshop via Zoom, unfortunately. Those slides are available on the OER website in the same place that the slides here will be available. In that first workshop, we reviewed Rhode Island's Executive Order 20-01, which establishes the 100% by 2030 renewable goal. And we talked about the importance of decarbonizing electricity in order to achieve the state's 80% carbon reductions by 2050 goal. Of course, it's important to decarbonize electricity because it is currently a large component of the state's emissions, and in order to hit the 80 by 50 goal, you need to reduce the emissions from the electric sector. It's also important because electricity is likely to provide a pathway for decarbonizing the other primary sectors, transportation and buildings, which is mostly heat, because electrifying those end uses is a very promising pathway to decarbonize them. And of course, that means very likely large increases in electricity demands, which will also need to be met with renewable electricity. We also talked a little bit about electricity system basics, how the system operates now with a mostly dispatchable fossil generating portfolio. and how it will operate in a decarbonized future where that the current system, the way the current system operates is kind of turned on its head, and the system will be dominated by renewable resources that are intermittent in nature and most of them can't be dispatched at the time when you would necessarily like to use the electricity. In addition to that, we reviewed a set of guiding principles to lead us through this analysis. Several principles relating to decarbonization, that Rhode Island intends to be a climate leader in this sector and needs to decarbonize the power sector, but also that the power sector should enable the decarbonization of other sectors in the economy. We identified a couple of economic principles as well, that of course the approach the state uses should be cost effective, and it should take into account equity across different customer classes, as well as economic development opportunities. And the third set of guiding principles had to do with policy implementation, that we want to make sure that the approach here is sustainable, including beyond 2030, and that it's consistent with Rhode Island's existing energy policies and other policies in other areas. In the last workshop, we also took an initial stab at defining the 100% goal and developing ways to measure it. And we gave an initial estimate of what that looked like, and you'll see more of that in just a few minutes. And I think we can jump ahead now, Ellen, to one thing we want to invite people to do. We've got the Q&A function in this webinar. We'll also have an opportunity to verbally respond to some questions that come in. We also want to encourage people to offer your comments after the workshop. There's an email address at the bottom of the screen here, energy.resources@energy.ri.gov. And we invite your feedback on a number of issues. We've identified a couple of them here, but by no means do we want to limit to these areas. If you've got questions or comments or factors that you think we should incorporate that are perhaps more involved than we can address through the chat function here, please submit and by email those issues to this email address at the bottom of the screen here. All right, and I think we're ready to dive into the meat of today's discussion. In order to do this, I'm going to turn over the microphone to Mike Haggerty, who's going to talk us through this sort of an update of electricity demand and what that implies for the renewable energy that we need to reach the 100% by 2030 goal. Mike, over to you.
Thanks, Dean. Can everyone hear me all right? Great. Well, at the end of our last workshop, we touched on this, but we wanted to give you an update on what we've been doing to make sure that we have as up-to-date information to do our analysis about the future needs to meet 100% renewables in Rhode Island. So you can see here a figure that we shared last time, and there's a few updates that I want to walk through on the left. So we start with the National Grid forecast from last year, which is the bar you can see on the left of this figure. We've taken a look at that to see whether there are any adjustments we wanted to make. We especially have made adjustments to the level of electrification and energy efficiency through 2030. So in our baseline projection, which is the second column, you can see that our 2030 projected demand is 7,700 gigawatt hours. And we've included in that projection about 5% adoption of light duty vehicles by 2030, as well as an additional 5% electrification of heating over and above what was already included in the, well, based on the ISO New England wide forecast. And we've also incorporated National Grid's forecast for energy efficiency, which you can see the energy efficiency is the light green on the top, which reduces load. You can see that we also have a reduction of load for behind the meter PV to get to our net load. So you can see that the values are slightly different from the National Grid forecast. And there's a range of about plus or minus 10% as you go from the baseline to the high and the low demand forecasts. In the high demand forecast, we've increased our assumptions about electrification, increasing light-duty vehicle electrification up to 15%, which adds about 300 gigawatt hours in 2030, and double the electrification of heating. In our low demand scenario, we're assuming that that level of electrification doesn't occur, and at the same time, you're getting increased energy efficiency to reduce demand, maintaining the current levels of energy efficiency annually through 2030. So we're using this analysis to project the amount of renewable demand by 2030, and we're aware that National Grid will be updating its load forecast in the next few months, and we'll be considering how to incorporate that as that's available. So if you can go to the next slide, Ellen. We have another poll for you. And our question this time is, which load forecast do you think is most realistic? A, the National Grid base forecast, one of the three forecasts we developed, baseline, high demand, low demand, or do you think all of them are off, or that we're way too low or way too high? Seems like we have some optimism about the load forecast and adoption of electrification, which gets interesting to see. We also have some thinking that all of the forecasts are too high, maybe leaning on hoping that additional energy efficiency efforts play out.
So I'm wondering, Ellen, if we were to go back and show the previous slide so people can see the forecast, does that keep the poll open so that people can continue to respond?
I believe it does, but Yasmin or Carrie, please correct me if I'm wrong.
Yes, it would remain open.
Awesome.
Okay, maybe we can just back up one slide so people can see the.
Okay, so if can we go back to the poll results? And it looks like we're at, I can't see the total, I think we're at 50. So let's move on. Ellen, can you move to the next slide, please? Great. All right, so the question then is, how much renewable generation do we need in 2030? And I'm going to walk through first the slide, or the figure on the left. That shows our projected demand from 2020 to 2030, and the gray bar at the top. That's our baseline projection. So there's some projections are slightly higher and some lower. And then the bottom of the figure shows our buildup of the amount of renewable energy that Rhode Island is currently projected to procure through its various programs. So you can see that starting from the bottom, that there's some renewable energy added through the regrowth program, through net metering, long-term contracts. There's a significant jump in 2024 when Revolution Wind is added. And on the top are showing that there are some additional projected additions through net metering and regrowth that have not yet been procured. So you can see that this stack of renewable generation that's been added to the system is relatively close to the current RES, which is starting at 16% in 2020 and rising up to about 31% in 2030. But that with Revolution Wind, that exceeds the current RES, which is putting excess RECs into the market that you sell to the rest of the mainland. And we've charted out a path to get to 100%, which is the yellowish, yellowish goldish line. So that increases, kind of tracks the renewable procurements through 2024, and then linearly increases up to 2030, where you hit the 100% renewable energy by 2030. So in 2030, we can see that this creates a gap that needs to be filled with additional renewable energy. And our current projections, based on the updated load forecast, as well as some additional information we received about the current Rhode Island programs, shows that you need to add about 4,400 gigawatt hours by 2030. And that there's a range here because we're accounting for the low and the high forecasts of 3,700 to 5,000 gigawatt hours. So the figure on the right then is intended to be indicative of how much renewable generation do you need if you only met that gap with each resource. So if you filled 4,400 gigawatt hours with offshore wind only, or the range of the gap, you would need somewhere between 800 and 1,100 megawatts of offshore wind. And that's 2 to 3 times more offshore wind than the current Revolution Wind contract. And so the range here accounts for each resource, accounts for this uncertainty in the load. But then the difference in megawatts is based on the fact that each renewable resource produces a different amount of generation per megawatt. So the capacity factor is higher for offshore wind, therefore you need less capacity. And then as the capacity factor is lower for these other resources, you need more capacity. So for land-based wind, you need 1,200 to 1,600 megawatts. And then for solar, you need significantly more, 2,600 to 3,500 for utility scale, and then a little bit more for distributed solar with a lower capacity factor. So just to put those numbers in the context, this would be about a 10x increase in the amount of distributed solar on the system. So we noted here at the bottom that net metering RECs are not contracted, which makes it a slightly different program than the other Rhode Island programs. And on the next slide, we talk about how this is something that we need to think about a bit more. The current net metering program allows generation owners of the net meter resources to retain the RECs and not to turn those RECs over to Rhode Island entities. And they can be sold to the rest of New England and therefore not specifically used to meet the Rhode Island RES. So this raises a question about the extent to which the net metering can be counted towards meeting the 100% goal as the program is currently structured and whether it should be structured in a different way going forward. On the next slide, we next look at what's the amount of renewable generation that we'll need to add after 2030 to maintain 100% renewables. So this figure shows Rhode Island load projection from 2020 today to 2030, which we've just went through, but then extends it out to 2050. And we have assumed here that Rhode Island will hit 80% greenhouse gas reductions by 2050, and that this results in significant electrification by that time. And so you can see how the additional load from light-duty vehicles, medium-duty vehicles, and heating increases load. We also see this gray area base load decreasing due to ongoing efforts to increase energy efficiency. So the big takeaway here is that through 2020 to 2030, we're going to need to add about 400 gigawatt hours, 440 gigawatt hours per year of renewable energy to meet this 100% goal in 2030. But then after that, we're going to have to continue adding a significant amount, just about the same amount, for about 400 gigawatt hours per year. And that's before accounting for the fact that resources that you procure in 2020 and 2025 are going to need to be replaced. So it could actually result in a greater amount of renewable procurements post 2030. So in the next slide, we wanted to reflect on what we've learned on this and what does that mean for Rhode Island policy. So 4 key points on that. First, in order to hit 100% renewables by 2030, you'll likely need to increase your renewable energy standard to 100%. Now, the renewable energy standard creates the demand for renewable energy and is a mechanism for tracking progress about whether you've achieved it or not. However, the RES alone is unlikely to succeed in isolation. We just have seen across New England that the RPS standards alone do not create the supply of renewable generation. So you'll need other renewable policy mechanisms to increase that amount of generation in the power system. One thing that we intended to note, but if we could go back a little bit to up 3 slides, Ellen. I just wanted to make a quick note that I skipped over one earlier, maybe 2. Back to the, yeah. So here we're showing behind the meter PV in 2 different colors, differentiating behind the meter PV that does not create RECs and those that create RECs. The issue here is that if you're creating RECs from behind the meter PV, that you're essentially double counting because you're both reducing retail sales, which is used to set the RES mandate, the demand for RECs, as well as producing RECs. So we've estimated how much of that behind the meter PV is producing RECs, and we think you need to account for that to ensure that you actually hit 100% and remove that double counting. Sorry for the skipping around here, but if we could then if we go back to the policy implications. Thanks, Ellen. We also see that the policies must adapt to a range of future load projections. As we all know, the future is uncertain. We know that this year better than other years that the future is uncertain. And that's going to certainly be true for 2030. So the policies that procure these resources to hit 100% will need to be flexible to hit that goal. Third, as I just mentioned, we need to consider the role of net metering resources to achieve 100%. What's the role there of producing RECs and retaining the RECs to meet the goal? And then also it's important to continue to seek out cost-effective energy efficiency. As reducing your load will reduce the need for renewable energy and find the right cost-effective level of energy efficiency for the future system. So I think unless Dean or Jürgen want to chime in with any other thoughts, we'll next move to our analysis of alternative renewable resources.
I think next we have another poll question that we would like to get people's input on. If we can just jump ahead to that.
Thanks for the reminder.
Right.
So the question is, would you support increasing the renewable energy standard to 100% by 2030? The RES is currently at 16% and is rising to 38.5% by 2035.
And recognizing that this is a little bit of an underspecified question, whether you support increasing the RES to 100%. We haven't yet said exactly how. We haven't provided you options of yes, no, but probably or probably not. So just generally whether you are supportive of that kind of an approach to increasing the renewable generation that the state requires.
So we're having about 70% of respondents so far are saying probably, which puts us about 30% at probably not or unsure. I'd definitely be interested for those that are in the probably not category about why that is. And for those that are unsure, what's leading you to be unsure about it and what additional information would be necessary to understand the role of the RES in meeting this goal.
This might be a good topic for people to respond offline with an email to the OER to give a little more color to your thoughts here.
All right, so if we can advance to the next slide now. So next we're going to talk about the different renewable resources that are available to meet this goal. And first wanted to just talk about how we analyze this question. What are the key factors that we're considering to provide information to Rhode Island in making the decision about how to meet this goal? So Rhode Island is seeking additional renewable energy generation. So in order to do that, you need to pay for the resources, the wind and the solar that we show on the left here. And so there's costs to doing so, resource acquisition costs. At the same time, when you procure that energy, there's market value in the wholesale energy market in New England. So that acts as an offset. So if you take the acquisition costs, which will show our analysis of that, as well as the energy market value revenues, that results in a net cost to Rhode Island ratepayers. And I just saw that someone noted that this is a key question for them about whether they'd want to hit, set the RES at 100%. So we analyzed in some of the slides later what our projected net cost to ratepayers are based on our current analysis. But there's also additional benefits of doing so. And those are shown on the left, that the renewable energy generation will provide Rhode Island reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, can also provide local economic impacts, including jobs, increased GDP for the state, as well as taxes. So we wanted to give you a sense of what we're going to be walking through next before we dive into some of the details. Next slide, please. And we have a question for you. What priorities should be considered in determining the path to meeting 100% renewables in Rhode Island? The utility bill impact, local economic impacts, emissions, and then two additional issues that we will be reviewing, but we're not presenting on today, land use impacts and environmental justice issues.
And I think you'll find in the poll interface, you will be able to rank these rather than just select one as the most important.
So we have about 20 results so far, so we'll give it a little bit more, but so far we're seeing that emissions are near the top, local economic impact is second, followed by the utility bill impact, environmental justice, and land use impact. So it seems like we've gotten to a place that's relatively stable here, even though a few results are coming in, showing that the key concern here is greenhouse gas emissions, followed by local economic and utility bill impacts, and then also environmental justice and land use impacts. So thanks everyone for your insights. That's really helpful to understand the different issues that we're weighing. Anything to add there, Dean?
I believe this poll will stay open for the next couple of minutes as we move on. So if you haven't entered your submission yet, please continue, and we'll tabulate it as it comes in.
Great. So now we're going to dive into some of the nitty-gritty here. Some of the analysis we've been doing. I want to share our approach, our basis for our analysis, and what we're finding. So the first thing that we did was we looked at the current and future costs of procuring and acquiring these renewable resources. And to do so, we wanted to be grounded in what we've recently seen in the New England market. So you can see on the right here our projection for offshore wind resource costs. And we have similar figures in the appendix slides for both land-based wind and for solar. And you can see on that there's several reference points. So we looked at the recent market data for procurements in New England. For offshore wind, that's included Vineyard Wind 1 and 2, Revolution Wind, as well as Mayflower Wind. And each of those contracts, we took the first year contract prices that have been reported publicly. We wanted to make sure that they were all comparable, so we made some adjustments to make sure that they were looking at the same lifetime, the same rates over prices over time, as well as the online year. We also removed the impact, or we added back the impact of the federal tax credits since those are phasing out. So that resulted in these 4 reference points. And then we made a projection based on those reference points going forward. And we used some of the cost reductions that have been projected by the National Renewable Energy Lab in their annual technology baseline to both create the base projection as well as the range of high and low. They have high and low cases in their analysis, and we used the similar percentage ranges on the high and the low side to create that uncertainty range. And the thing that we also will be stepping through in the next few slides are some of the significant changes beyond the resource costs that need to be considered about the total cost of procuring these resources, especially trends in the cost of T&D system upgrades. But one other thing to note here is that this is certainly a source of significant uncertainty, likely beyond these bounds. We've been reviewing these projections with renewable developers to make sure that they find them to be reasonable. We've generally heard that they are, based on the market data that's available today. But there's just a lot of uncertainties out there for them. And something like offshore wind is still a relatively nascent industry. We have a bunch of new resources coming in that still are just starting their construction. So there's still a lot of learning out there as we get to these higher levels of offshore wind, as well as increasing the scale of utility scale solar, as well as DG solar across the system. So in the next slide, we show across the different resources what our projections are. And the figure on the left only shows that base cost projection. There'd just be too many lines on here to show the uncertainty, but the uncertainty is reflected in 2030 on the figure on the right. So the takeaways that we've found from this are that there really are a similar projection of costs of some of these larger resources, the offshore wind, land-based wind, and utility scale solar. And there's different projections for how they will evolve over time. You could, if you continue to see utility scale solar decreasing at this rate, it will end up for just the resource acquisition costs lower than offshore wind. But you'll see on the right that the uncertainty bands overlap very significantly. Distributed solar is a smaller resource installed in much smaller capacities and is a higher cost. And we've based our projections here really on a basket of different distributed solar resources, from a 10 kilowatt resource on your roof to a 1 megawatt resource out on a landfill. So this is intended to reflect the mix of distributed solar resources that we've recently seen through the regrowth program. And those resources are higher cost, but they're also more local resources and are likely to have higher local economic impacts. So even though it looks like they're significantly higher here, there's reasons to procure those resources. So next we want to talk a little bit about the resource availability and some of the future cost considerations. So first, looking at wind, offshore and land-based wind. You see in the table on the left that there's a significant amount of offshore wind that's currently being pursued in New England. The capacity in the queue is referring to the New England-wide ISO New England generation interconnection queue, where generation resources have to request their resources to be studied. And there's over 12,000 megawatts of offshore wind currently in the New England queue. There's also some significant land-based wind. In Maine, there's about 2,200 megawatts, as well as 4,000 megawatts in New York. We know New York because recent contracts that Rhode Island has signed for land-based wind have been resources actually located in New York. And we've included Rhode Island land-based wind. It's included in the regrowth program. We're not currently seeing any resources being developed in Rhode Island. So some of the things that you need to consider for offshore wind is that there's a lot of interest currently, and there's a significant amount of leased area available for wind offshore. So we don't see that as a constraint, but there are additional considerations in terms of the future costs that I just referred to on the previous slides, as well as challenges for interconnection. There's limited onshore interconnection points available, as well as need for upgrades of the system to bring that power onto the land. So this is something that we expect to increase going forward. The costs that we have for the current resources are wrapped within the values that we showed on the previous slides. But as you add more and more offshore wind resources, you're likely going to need to increase your costs to reach more distant injection points for offshore transmission, as well as increase onshore system upgrades to reach the load centers. And we've estimated that this could increase the future offshore wind costs by $5 to $15 per megawatt hour. All right, if we can move to the next slide, talk about solar. As I noted, we've looked at a range of different solar resource scales. On the left, that goes from small scale, which is less than 25 kilowatts, all the way up to some of the larger resources that we've currently recently seen be procured that we refer to as utility scale, over 5 megawatts. And we provide some examples of what they mean, since there's 5 different kinds, from residential and small business rooftop up to the large scale ground mounted. And the recent Synapse study is very helpful in this regard in understanding the technical as well as economic potential for these resources. You can see that for the small and medium scale resources, they will likely play a smaller role. They wouldn't be able to meet 100% on their own, and we also don't expect them to. So you would really need a basket of these resources. And the larger scale resources that we are seeing in the ISO New England interconnection queue reflect the technical potential that Synapse found, several gigawatts of resources. An issue with distributed solar is also the interconnection costs. We've been talking with National Grid to understand the hosting capacity of the current system. We've reviewed recent interconnection cost data, which is the cost that they need to pay to add their resource to the system. And that has historically been in about $100 to $200 per kilowatt range over the last 4 or 5 years. The current 2020 data is showing a significant increase of about $400 per kilowatt. It's unclear exactly which of those resources will be built, but talking to National Grid as well as distributed generation, solar distributed generation resource developers, this is a real trend. This is something that people are seeing, that costs are increasing. And to give a sense of what that means, an increase in interconnection costs of $200 to $300 per kilowatt would increase DG solar costs by $10 to $24 per megawatt hour. So these system upgrades could add significant costs to these resources that might offset some of the cost declines that we've seen based on just the cost of the resource components alone. On the next slide, we summarize some of these uncertainties. I think we've touched upon all of these. Maybe just to run through them, we're seeing that offshore winds, we had a highly competitive amount of early projects that were submitted into these procurements. It's possible that with that interest in getting into the market, that could have depressed prices. But we'll see. There's a lot to learn from this market and what the future costs will be. I believe the other uncertainties we've all touched on. So generally we're seeing that these interconnection costs could increase the cost in the future, but at the same time, technological and cost advances could reduce the costs as well as increase scale of building these resources in New England. So if we go to the next slide, we also wanted to touch on why we haven't been talking about certain resources so far. We've looked at whether other resource types such as landfill gas, other eligible biomass, small hydro, tidal hydro, and fuel cells should be considered. And generally we found that these resources are either limited in the capacity potential that's available in the market or the costs. And so we don't expect, we're not saying that these won't play a role in the future of meeting 100% renewables in Rhode Island, but we're not evaluating them closely because we just don't think that they'll play as large a role as the other resources that we've stepped through. So if we can go to the next slide. Again, we want to kind of pull together what we see to be the policy implications of this analysis of the different renewable resource types. Talking about the uncertainty in procurement costs, we think it's important that Rhode Island develop mechanisms that adapt to this significant uncertainty in procurement costs. We just don't know exactly which resources will be the lowest costs by 2030, or as we step along to getting to 100% in 2030. So to reflect that, our recommendation would be to create programs that allow resources to compete to provide renewable energy at the lowest cost to Rhode Island. And that can be challenging. We're talking about very different resource types. We're talking about 400, 500 megawatts for each offshore wind procurement compared to a basket of DG solar, some of which are 25 kilowatts on top of people's houses. So finding the right way to get those to compete is something that should be considered to find the lowest cost approach to meeting Rhode Island. We also want to note that we haven't seen any resource limitations that would prevent Rhode Island from getting to 100%, but note that the smaller scale solar is a bit more limited, but can still contribute to a distributed solar portfolio. And then last, this interconnection cost issue is becoming increasingly important. Hosting capacity studies and information provided by utilities like National Grid can provide some very important near-term information for developing distributed resources. But you also have to take a longer-term view of this and think about what T&D upgrades are going to be necessary across these different resource types. And there's lots of interesting and important questions to address early on to figure out what the approach will be for that, including the cost assignment rules and practices, whether costs should remain specific to projects through interconnection costs, or if you should build out the system beforehand and then include those costs in rate base and retail rates. And then you also have to consider how you treat different types of resources and their different transmission and distribution needs. Are you doing this for all resources, or are there specific resources that you're going to focus on? In addition, there's a great opportunity here for Rhode Island to work with other New England states to ensure that there's especially sufficient transmission capacity to access and integrate renewable generation resources at the lowest total cost to Rhode Island ratepayers. Clearly, that's been noted as an important consideration.
Okay, we're actually running, surprisingly, a little ahead of schedule today. Thanks, Mike. I really appreciate your walking us through this.
I apologize if I went too fast. We'll take an opportunity now for some Q&A, and in a moment, I'll turn to Carrie and see if she can raise some particular issues that she's seen coming through the chat function. We'll take a little while for Q&A. We'll probably answer some of these in the background. Hopefully, Carrie will be able to pull up a couple of them that we can discuss verbally here, and then we'll take a break for about 10 minutes once we're done with the Q&A and resume. It says here on the slide at 10:30, but we'll probably come back earlier since we'll be breaking a little earlier. But if I can turn to Carrie now and see if she has seen any themes coming through on the Q&A function or the chat function that you'd like to have us address.
Thank you so much to everyone who has submitted a question through the Q&A function. It's the icon at the bottom of the Zoom webinar screen. We've gotten in so many questions, and we've been able to answer some already just via writing within the Q&A box itself. So please do look for our answer there. I'm going to suggest some questions for the Brattle team based on themes that I've seen come in. Please note that if we do not answer your question specifically now, there will be another Q&A at the end of the webinar, and we always invite public comments and questions coming in through our email address, energy.resources@energy.ri.gov, and we'll give you that email address again. So we've gotten a couple questions asking about incentives. Can you guys explain how you're including incentives as currently structured in our different programs in the analysis, and how you're thinking about incentives into the future years as we get close to 2030 and as we move on from there?
Let me take an initial crack at that, and then Mike or Jürgen, you may have something to add. Right now, we are looking primarily at the cost of the resources. We're not necessarily yet considering the program costs that may be involved to acquiring those resources. So we're not making a projection of this level of rebate value or incentive will cause adoption of this much of a particular technology. Much of that comes in the next phase of this project when we try to translate what we've learned here about sort of what resources make sense on the basis of the cost of the resource itself. And we'll translate that through the question of what policy mechanisms do you use in order to get those resources. So for example, for distributed solar, the resource itself has a particular cost. A program that encourages that resource through rebates or incentives may have a different cost than that. And so we haven't yet gotten to the point where we're considering those program costs. So we're really just looking right now at the cost of the resource itself, not yet considering the programs that'll be involved to acquire those resources. Mike, do you have anything to add to that, or Jürgen?
Yeah, the cost of these resources have to be paid by someone. So we're currently trying to take a look at, based on our projection of the costs, what would be, how should you account for that and which types of resources you procure. We did phase out the federal tax credits that are going to be phased out since those are currently uncertain if they'll be extended. One thing we did include was the solar 10% ITC that is maintained after the phase out, so that is still a part of our analysis because that impacts the costs to Rhode Island ratepayers. But we're trying to understand what those costs look like, and then, as Dean said, we'll think about how you can then go about procuring those through different mechanisms.
I guess I'll chime in a little bit because Dave also asked about what will be done to limit the cost of ratepayers and of these renewable energy portfolios, and how much of it is sort of negotiating power with the renewable developers. So I think I would just say that in this stage of the analysis, we start with sort of a bottom-up estimate of the cost of various types of renewables. And that essentially assumes that there is sufficient competition among projects, if you want, that apply to sort of meet the 100% RES, that the price, the PPA prices that get paid in the end are kind of are brought down to that bottom-up estimate of economic costs. And that just means, you need to pay for the metal and all that stuff. And there is a profit margin for the developers, but the profit margin is sort of what economists call a normal profit, which means it compensates them for the capital they're putting at risk. So that's at this phase. And we're not at all at this point sort of going to the next phase where we're thinking about how the state might do that efficiently. I think it is sort of important to recognize that different approaches to procuring renewables may have implications for how competitive the outcome is. But as you know, so we're not doing that yet. So that's like, once we move beyond this stage, we're going to think about policy mechanisms that ideally minimize the cost to ratepayers ultimately of meeting the goal, which is to say that trying to develop mechanisms that do create this sort of competitive outcome that I just described. I hope that helps.
Thanks, everyone. And for all of you who are interested in what current programs and incentives we do have, I encourage everyone to go to our website, energy.ri.com, or sorry, .gov, and we have plenty of information there. Our next question is about health impacts, and then we've gotten a number of questions also about other non-energy impacts, such as impacts to land for siting. We've also gotten a number of questions that reference docket 4600, which is Rhode Island's framework for a benefit cost analysis that takes into account these non-energy benefits and impacts. I'm wondering if you guys could describe a little bit about how you're thinking about these non-energy impacts in this analysis. You might speak specifically to health benefits or health impacts, but also to any other sort of impact that you guys account for.
Yeah, again, I'll take an initial cut of this and invite my colleagues to add. So in terms of the health benefits, we certainly acknowledge the health benefits of reducing the amount of fossil generation in the region, because fossil emits not only greenhouse gases, but also nitrogen oxides and particulates and other pollutants that have negative health impacts. One reason that we're not focusing on that is because we are looking at alternative ways to get to 100% renewable energy. And because all of those pathways reach 100% renewable energy, they will all have a similar impact, not an identical impact, but a similar impact on the amount of fossil generation in the region. And so we would expect that their impacts, looking just at the 100% renewable goal, the impact of alternative ways of getting to that 100% renewable goal will likely be similar across different paths that you might take to get there, different resource mixes that you might take to get there. So we are not focusing closely on that. Another issue, of course, is that Rhode Island is part of the New England electricity grid. And the fact that Rhode Island will, by 2030, be 100% renewable does not necessarily have a major impact on where the generation is coming from. Rhode Island can acquire renewable resources that are outside the state. And similarly, even after Rhode Island achieves 100% renewable, there will very likely still be fossil generators within the state that are serving load for other states, because the New England grid is one sort of unified grid. The fact that Rhode Island is demanding less fossil energy will have some impact on the amount of overall fossil generated in the region, but Rhode Island only accounts for about 6% of all of New England, and the impact of Rhode Island's reduction in fossil demand spread across all of New England is likely to have a fairly modest effect on the in-state production of fossil energy. So while we do acknowledge and applaud those the health benefits of switching from fossil to renewable, those benefits won't be focused on Rhode Island, and that sort of the question of the location of the fossil generation that remains after Rhode Island hits 100% renewable is kind of beyond the scope of this study. So it's not an area of particular focus for this study.
Thank you. Friendly reminder to everyone that if you have a question you would like to ask the Brattle team, please do enter it through the Q&A function on Zoom rather than through the chat. We've gotten a series of questions related to the intermittency of renewable energy and to the value of energy storage. Can the team respond to how that's being thought about during this analysis and how it's being incorporated?
I'm happy to take that as well, unless one of my colleagues would like to jump in. So renewable energy is intermittent. Right now, the New England grid is dominated by fossil energy, and in the near and medium term, additional renewables will reduce the amount of fossil energy that needs to be generated at the time those renewables are producing. So in the middle of the day for solar, when it's windy for wind power. We will reach a point in New England, assuming that other states continue on their current trajectory and maybe accelerate their trajectories of renewable energy. We will reach a point where there will be hours when the total amount of renewable energy production exceeds the amount of demand. So your net load, so to speak, will become negative. And then we'll have an issue of how do you manage that? Do you just curtail the renewables? Do you have opportunities to capture that energy using storage technologies, which might be batteries or pumped hydro storage, to move it to another time when it is valuable? You'll see a little bit of discussion of this, and after the break, we'll talk about how we're modeling the New England market. But this is an important issue, and the fact that pretty much all the solar panels across New England tend to produce power at similar times means that in the middle of a sunny day, there can be potentially an overgeneration from solar. California is already seeing this because they've installed a lot of solar, and they have problems with this. This is a problem that needs to be solved. We believe that it can be solved, and storage is one of the ways to solve that. Another way to solve that, or to help solve that, or reduce the problem arising really, is to procure a balanced mix of resources, so that the renewable and the wind resources, the various types, complement one another where possible. The problem will still arise as we approach a system that is dominated more and more by renewables, and we do need to address that problem. There are a couple of ways that we can do that, and we'll talk more later. Mike or Jürgen, do you have additional points to add here?
I think there was one question that I answered live about the role of hydrogen, for example. So I think we should point out that, as we've done in the past, so the role of intermittency it's in the background. We model it. We use basically hourly generation profiles for the various resources. And then obviously that intermittency has to be dealt with in a way that creates a reliable electricity supply. And so our modeling does that. Since Rhode Island is a relatively small state, and is part of the New England electric system, the problem of intermittency and needing to balance load can be managed as long as Rhode Island is sort of the only state in New England that pushes quickly towards 100% renewable electricity. Since then, sort of a lot of the balancing, as sort of we call it, can come from the rest of the New England system. And that, it doesn't have to be renewable at that point, as long as, at least the way we define it, as long as over the course of the year, Rhode Island procures 100% of its demand from renewables. So in the near term, through 2030 for sure, so that sort of storage issue is likely more one that should be looked at in the context of Rhode Island being part of the New England system. Now, as we move beyond 2030, and we'll discuss that a little bit later on, right? So the 100% renewable energy target remains, but the rest of the New England states will also decarbonize and move towards much more renewables. And then sort of this balancing from the rest of the New England system becomes a little more complicated, since then the whole system needs to do the balancing. And then I think storage will become a much more important issue system-wide, including things other than batteries that are really good to sort of balancing the system over a relatively short period of time, not so much seasonally, for example. So then, in all likelihood, much more has to be invested in the types of resources that can provide, this balancing, whether that's batteries or fuel cells using hydrogen or something, or pumped storage, whatever it may be, in New England. And some of that will probably be located in Rhode Island, and some of it will be located outside of Rhode Island. So it is an issue that we are looking at, but we're looking at it as being primarily an issue in the 2030 to 2050 timeframe.
I'll just add one thing, because I saw a comment come in the Q&A about the balancing role of demand-side management. And that is another way to address this issue, not from the supply side, but rather the demand side. And My personal belief is that the opportunities for demand side management to play a larger role in balancing supply with demand are likely to increase over time, particularly because of the electrification of the other primary sectors, and especially transportation. Because an electric vehicle, is likely to spend more time parked and potentially charging than it is driving, there is some flexibility in when it charges. And if we can harness that flexibility to enable the charging to occur at the times when the system has the resources to provide that energy, and to delay or avoid charging at times when the system is short, that is another tool alongside storage and backup generation that will help us to balance supply and demand over time. Again, as Jürgen said, that's likely to come into play primarily farther into the future as renewable penetration increases well beyond where it is now, and we start bumping up into those system constraints of actually having too much renewable energy at some times and too little energy at other times.
Thanks for that response. We have time for one more question, and this question is about what types of costs are included in the cost projections for renewables. Some examples are interconnection costs and soft costs. Can you all respond a little bit to that?
Mike, do you want to take that?
Sure, yeah. The costs that we are using are based on the costs to date that have been necessary to bring these resources onto the system. As Dean noted before, it might have been Jürgen noted before, there's several different mechanisms, and many of them are, we see significant competition. And so we think that the cost, the cost to ratepayers of each of these programs reflects the total cost to bring the resources, including the wind turbines, the solar panels, the development costs, those interconnection costs to date, as well as project management costs and the return that's necessary to put the capital up to build those resources. So all of those costs that go into developing a resource today, we think it's the reference points that we have reflect all those inputs, and the question is, what will that look like going forward? How much will certain costs, certain components of those costs decrease? They could increase, such as the interconnection costs that we highlighted. So it's really the all-in costs to bring these resources to the market that we've included in our analysis.
Yeah, I mean, just to sort of add a little bit, so we're projecting these costs forward over various time frames, and there were references to various elements here: interconnection costs, soft cost. I think it's important to recognize that the actual costs of any specific project, can be quite idiosyncratic depending on where they're located. So we use just the broad publicly available information about the cost and cost projections for these types of resources, including things like soft costs and integration costs. They are part of the projections that are being made. And then we're benchmarking, as we did. We might have gone fast over that. I mean, we're benchmarking kind of those to actually observe prices for various projects. And so between those two, we derive a trajectory. That trajectory will be wrong. I mean, there's no doubt that it will sort of be wrong, but that's what we know today. And we're developing recommendations only based on what we know today, as opposed to the things we'll have known ex post. So yeah, I think that's, but we're taking into account, these costs are all being taken into account, and the predicted or projected change in those cost components over time as well.
I think that's also important that we got some input from renewable developers themselves to understand how reasonable they thought our projections were, and there's many things that they flagged about why they could be higher or lower, but found them to be reasonable. So that's why we're using them as the basis of our analysis.
Thanks all for that additional information. I think at this point we are at our break time. And so we will do our best during break to respond by text to all of the remaining questions, and those that we don't get to, we'll hold for the second half and for the Q&A at the end of this webinar.
Okay, thanks, Carrie. So we'll take a break now for about 10 minutes. We'll come back at about 10:30 and invite you to get a cup of coffee, step away from Zoom for a moment, and we'll reconvene in about 10 minutes.
Hi, folks. This is Nick Ucci. I think hopefully everybody can gather together back to their computers. We can get going for the next part of the presentation. I think there are just one or two other questions that might be worth trying to address here. And one of them, I know we've received several questions around 4600. And I appreciate those questions. I think it's 4600 is a framework, not the framework, but a means in which we can examine various cost and benefit categories, and it may be helpful in particular when it's done specifically to specific regulatory. Apologize for that. I have my kids here at home. So I think it can be helpful when applied to specific regulatory requests. I don't think that that's the case here. There won't be a direct regulatory proposal made out of this study. And I think folks should be comforted by the fact that in many ways we are accounting for many, if not most, of those categories in the 4600 framework, either analytically, qualitatively, or by other means. So, if folks have specific questions about costs and benefits, we certainly welcome them in the Q&A, and we'll work to address them. But I hope that, at least I hope that explains, where we stand with this study. Carrie, any other, your time for maybe one more question, maybe to the Brattle folks? Anything you want to bring up?
Absolutely. We got a number of good questions asking about how the environmental justice community will be included in this project to make sure that the analysis not only accounts for all perspectives, but also results in an equitable set of policy recommendations. And so maybe Commissioner Ucci, if you'd like to speak to that first, and then if the Brattle team would like to add anything, that would be great. Oh, I think that there are some audio issues. Maybe I can ask the Brattle team to respond first. Again, the question was related to how the team is incorporating perspectives from the environmental justice community in order to ensure an equitable set of policy recommendations.
Let me try to go first, since I'm in the middle of typing an answer to that question, actually. So, which I will not stop and just answer it live, and then Dean and Mike might have an additional perspective. I think we did talk to representatives of that community, but I think that one piece of good news, I think, is that unlike in the past, when dirty stuff was basically located in places that hurt particularly vulnerable populations. So here we're talking about locating renewable energy resources and their sort of negative impact on the surrounding communities is at least very significantly smaller than the corresponding impact from, say, coal-fired power plants in the past. So in that sense, I think it's a little bit less about which populations get harmed as a result of this, setting aside the issue of who pays for these things, of course. So clearly, there is a potential impact on average ratepayer cost, and how vulnerable populations are to some extent protected from potential rate increases is a separate and important topic. But I think with respect to the environmental justice piece, we're cleaning up the Rhode Island electricity system. So at least the trajectory ought to be that sort of to remove harm that might have been inflicted in the past. And then beyond that, one can also ask whether the policies that are implemented to achieve the 100% renewable electricity targets could be used specifically to help those communities that are disadvantaged and have been disadvantaged in the past. So that's I see that as part of the second half of the project, when one uses not just sort of a pure bottom-up quantitative assessment of which type of resource is cheapest, but then in that second phase, one can do a more balanced weighing of pros and cons of various procurement approaches. So to the extent that, for example, a renewable procurement might create jobs in local communities, then locating more of those projects in the communities where where it would benefit vulnerable populations is one potential approach to bringing that topic in through policy development. Well, I'll stop there and see whether others want to add.
I just want to speak more broadly to the topic about energy and environmental justice, and I think that as I've said in other forums, I think we're all grappling with this, right? I think the first step is to look inward, and I know a lot of our agencies, including OER and DEM and others, are starting to do that, starting to connect with local grassroots organizations to better understand their perspectives, working to educate and train ourselves. For instance, Yasmin here is on this webinar, and OER hired her as someone to work on these issues full time and to help me and my staff better understand these issues, and then to look outward and figure ways to better integrate it into the work we do every day. And I know that I believe there was a discussion at the recent Executive Climate Change Council just a week or so ago on this topic as well. So I know on behalf of the administration that we have these issues on our minds, especially now in what's going on all around us in society. And I think we're working to try to make strides and integrate those perspectives and the lessons that can be learned into our daily work.
Thank you, Nick. So I think we are ready to get back to the presentation, and with that sort of lead in about the importance of energy justice issues, we're gonna dive back for a little bit into the sort of hard economics that we can quantify, and always keep in mind that that's not the only thing that's important, but it is an important component of it. Not least because it impacts the total cost to all ratepayers, and limiting the impact to vulnerable communities requires limiting the impact overall, first of all, and then questions of distribution. So let's dive back in. Ellen, if we can move forward to the next slide, and the next slide after this. I'll talk about our next topic is to begin to understand the market value and how these renewables that Rhode Island will acquire can interact with the New England market, and that'll help us to evaluate these renewable portfolios. So in New England, all electricity generators, including renewables, will sell their power into the New England wholesale market. And of course, load buys power back from that market. To the extent that generation might be associated with particular load, that sort of buying and selling might happen at the same price, and so it's a wash. But it's important to recognize that the fundamental nature of this market is going to change substantially, even by 2030, and perhaps especially thereafter, due to the significant addition of renewable energy generators across the system. That is in part driven by Rhode Island, but as we mentioned before, Rhode Island is a very small component of New England overall. And so it'll be driven probably more by other states, changes in other states that are also decarbonizing their electricity sources, albeit less quickly than Rhode Island is doing. And other states may actually increase or accelerate their targets for renewable energy generation. When you, and we touched on this earlier, when you add more intermittent renewables to the system, since the timing of their output is not controllable, they produce when the sun shines or when the wind blows. As you add more of these to the system, that can affect the market value of these resources themselves. So the output of renewable resources of a particular type is highly correlated. So the amount of wind at a particular offshore wind farm is closely related to the amount of wind that is at the next offshore wind farm. And because power is hard to store, if you're putting a lot of power onto the system at the same time from resources of similar types, that will depress the price at those particular times. And it's not easy, or at least it's not cheap, to take power from one point in time and move it to another point in time. So as an example with solar, once you've added a lot of solar generation to the system, and it's producing a lot of energy in the middle of the day, and perhaps more energy even than is needed in the middle of the day, adding more solar resources to the system will provide diminishing value. Not that it's not still valuable, but it will be less valuable than generation that you might be able to dispatch. The same is true for wind, of course, in different hours. But to capture how that dynamic will work out over time, we use a model that we call GridSim. It is a Brattle in-house model that models capacity expansion and the short-term operations of the system to characterize how the grid will operate both in the near term and then in the longer term beyond 2030. And one of the outputs of this model is the market price in a very short term, at an hourly level, in a decarbonized future that is characterized by high renewables penetration. Let me move forward, and hopefully this will make a little bit more sense as we start talking about this. So the modeling framework, it looks a lot at a very high level like any electricity system simulation model, where you've got a number of inputs. So you characterize the supply of generation, both the existing resources and potential new resources, looking at both fixed and variable costs. You look at demand for electricity using here an hourly representation of demand. Because of the amount of time that we're looking at, multiple years in the future, we don't look at every single hour of the year. We choose a set of representative days that are distributed across the seasons and capture the difference and the variability in characteristics over time. We also consider the need for what's currently called capacity, and that concept is evolving over time, but essentially the ability to generate power at the moment that you need it. Right now that comes from dispatchable fossil resources. In the future, that'll be provided in a different way. We also include some assumptions for regulations and policies, particularly regarding carbon emissions and renewables, and we project those over time. The model itself is it's essentially an optimization engine. It finds the best solution that will allow you to meet electric load over time, given the existing and potential new resources that are available. It allows you to meet your electric demands over time in the lowest cost way. And of course, we have some requirements that we place on the model, that it has to provide enough energy in each and every hour. There has to be enough ancillary services to balance the system and keep it operating in a reliable fashion. And in this instance, we are not modeling transmission constraints within New England, but that's a capability of the model. So the resulting outputs include generation operation as well as additions and retirements of generation over time. And what we'll see, of course, is that that is primarily clean energy generation that is added over time. We also look at the hourly operations, and coming out of that is the energy market price, the hourly energy market price that we use in this to evaluate the cost to consumers. And also another result, of course, is the emissions that comes out of this. But as I mentioned before, the various strategies that we're looking at will all reach 100% by 2030, and so the emissions impacts should be quite similar across them. I've got a fair amount of background noise here. If someone can let me know if that becomes a problem, I might be able to see if I can do something about that. But for right now, let's jump ahead to the next slide. We validated this model using 2018, looking at actual 2018 New England market prices and characterizing in the model. We replicated the 2018 market conditions, including gas prices and the available generation mix. And then we compared the results of the model, running it for 2018, with those actual New England market prices to see how well they align. We've illustrated that on the right here with a price duration curve, and that just says out of all the 8,760 hours in the year, let's order them in the order of the highest price to lowest price, and plot them out here on a graphic to see what they look like. And comparing the lighter blue and the darker blue lines, the lighter blue being the modeled hourly prices and the darker blue being historical prices, we find that they match reasonably well. The average over all hours matches pretty well. It's not an exact match, and that's primarily driven by differences at the extremes. In the actual market, prices got higher in a few hours than the model would predict, but we believe it's a good match, and it validates the use of the model, certainly against largely fossil-based system. There are some limitations within the model, like we're modeling a single zone within New England, so we don't model transmission congestion that can push up prices in some particular areas, and we're modeling, as I said, only representative days, not every single hour of the year, which explains why the modeled curve looks a little rougher than the more smooth historical curve. So if we can jump to the next slide and look here at demand projections for New England. This slide looks a lot like one we saw previously. The previous slide was looking at Rhode Island demand. This looks at all of New England. It's similar because there are similar sets of assumptions to it. But the thing that's really striking here, of course, is we're projecting a lot of growth in electric load as the current non-electric sectors electrify large amounts of their energy needs. And so by 2030, which is the year that we're focusing most on, we don't see very large amounts of electrification. Electrification will be getting going, but not a huge amount of load will be electrified by then. And so we're following the ISO New England's CELT forecast, their most recent forecast. We've made a few modifications to make it match for Rhode Island's energy efficiency and photovoltaic additions to make it consistent with how we're looking at Rhode Island. And we've assumed only moderate electrification by 2030, although this is a little higher electrification than the ISO projects by then. But projecting beyond 2030 out to 2050, we are projecting a system that achieves the region-wide 80 by 50 decarbonization goals that all the New England states share, using two methods: aggressive electrification of the heating and vehicle sector, and aggressive efficiency improvements in what is currently the current base load, the traditional electricity uses. These 2050 load projections are based on an analysis that we had done maybe a year and a half ago, of what New England would look like if it meets its 2050 targets of decarbonizing its entire economy.
Hey, Dean, let me just jump in because somebody had a question early on about the load in 2030, and when we started this whole thing and we had a poll about whether 7 point something or was the right number, and I just sort of point out that there are others than groups other than Brattle who are now and have tried to sort of project what a New England system might look like by 2050. And it's just important to recognize there are huge uncertainties about how much electrification ultimately takes place. There are, as we and others have pointed out, there are other pathways to decarbonizing some elements here. The work that we did with Nick and the team on heating sector decarbonization in Rhode Island went into that to some extent. So it's not clear how much electrification happens, and then even harder to project at what pace that would proceed. And so it's just important to recognize that this is a projection, and that ultimately policies that get implemented have to be flexible and recognize the fact that it is impossible to forecast with precision what load will be in 2030, and therefore how much renewable energy somehow has to be procured to meet 100% of that load.
Thanks, Jürgen. Okay, if we can move on to get a preview of the results. What we show here is where the energy in New England will come from over time. And on the left, we show generation by source, by different type of generator. And on the right, we show the installed capacity by different kinds of generators. So key things to look at are the yellow, which is solar, and the dark green, which is offshore wind. And you'll notice that those, looking on the left at generation, those resources produce more and more energy over time. We've shown here snapshots for every 5 years, starting with 2020, going out to 2040. And you'll see that even by 2030, the amount of generation from these renewable sources will increase fairly significantly. And you see a corresponding decrease in the orange area, which is the natural gas-fired energy. And this is just renewables replacing fossil energy. By that middle bar, 2030, that's when Rhode Island itself achieves 100% renewables. But of course, New England overall won't be at 100% renewable by 2030. It will be on its way to that. It'll be, certainly Rhode Island's efforts will accelerate the overall decarbonization of New England, but it won't achieve it all by itself. Beyond 2030, we see very large increases in the amounts of renewable energy. And you also see big increases in the amount of total energy. And of course, that's because of the electrification of the transportation sector and the building sector. So not only are renewables providing a larger share, but the total amount of electricity is going up over time. You'll see on the two bars on the right, some cross-hatched areas at the top. What we're illustrating there are curtailments of both wind and solar energy that is produced at a time when it can't be utilized. And this is even after taking account of storage capability, both from implicit storage from hydro and explicit storage from pump storage, and ultimately from batteries or other storage technologies. There will still be some curtailment of renewable energy. It's modest in our projection here, but it will occur. Another thing to notice is if you look on the left, you see the decreasing size of the orange bars over time. That's as we're burning less gas over time. We're producing less energy from natural gas over time. But on the right, you'll see that the orange bars, the size of the orange bars stays more or less constant over time. What this indicates is that the gas capacity is being kept around for reliability. But we're actually running it much, much less over time. If you were to project this all the way out to 2050, in order to meet New England's 80 by 50 goals, you'd see that natural gas generation, the energy component from natural gas, has to go essentially to zero. And that may occur through a transition from fossil gas to renewable gas. That's a little too far out for us to project that with confidence. But it's important to note that reducing generation from gas capacity does not necessarily mean that all the gas plants are retired. They will be kept around at least for a while to provide reliability to the system. Another factor to note is you see the difference in the size of the renewable bars especially as we move out to the right. You'll see more solar capacity is added, look to the right-hand graph, than offshore wind. And yet the offshore wind generates more energy than the solar. And that's just because a megawatt of offshore wind produces more energy than the solar. It's producing for a greater number of hours at a higher share of its rated output. So a smaller amount of offshore wind capacity can provide more energy than solar. We account for that in our economic evaluation by looking at the cost per unit of energy, the cost per megawatt hour. We can go on to the next slide. This illustrates, and I apologize for the density of this slide. It's a little hard to read. But this illustrates the price outcome that we are interested in for this analysis, which says what is the market value of generation of a particular type and how does that change over time. Again, here, just like before, we have a price duration curve, and we show 5 of them at different snapshots in time every 5 years, starting in 2020. You will see that over time, the average price increases for the next few years. One of the reasons that happens is just that gas prices are currently setting electricity prices, and that will still be true even in 10 years. Natural gas prices are rising over time and driven largely by the fact that right now gas prices are very, very cheap. That's partly fueled by the pandemic, the decrease in gas demand that's caused by the current pandemic. It's also partly caused by the fact that last winter was not a particularly cold winter and did not involve particularly high gas prices in the winter months, where in a normal year, gas prices would have gotten considerably higher. So if you look over time, you can follow first the dark blue line for 2020, then the lighter blue line for 2025, and then the green line for 2030. You see that trend of prices increasing over time as gas prices rise. And even by 2030, zero prices will be rare. We won't have a lot of hours when renewable generation exceeds load, just because there won't be that much renewable generation on the system yet by then. But then proceeding beyond 2030 into 2035 and 2040, you see that those curves, the sort of lighter green, yellowish color for 2035 and 2040, which is an orange color, you see there are significant numbers of hours in those years where prices will fall to zero, because there's so much renewable energy on the system by that time that there will be a number of hours when you won't need all of that renewable generation, even though it's being provided at that time. And that'll push energy prices to zero for significant numbers of hours. One important note as those energy prices are being pushed down, that doesn't mean that electricity overall is necessarily getting cheaper, although with time as costs come down, there will be some reduction in prices. What it means in part is that the energy component of electricity costs will fall, but that will be shifting costs into other components of energy costs. So for ancillary services, for capacity to ensure reliability, and into REC markets to reward renewable generation for their renewable attributes. So once we've got this, we can take this forward into our analysis of the different kinds of renewable generation. And so I wanted, in the next couple of slides, let's jump ahead one more. I wanted to give a little insight into this notion of renewable generation, different types of renewable generation produce energy at different times. And how does that affect the value of those various types of renewable generation? Just to get you grounded on this, in the top two graphics, we show a typical day for the winter on the left and the summer on the right. And we show the output of the three kinds of renewable generation that we're focusing on here, hour by hour. This is actually the average over the winter days and the average over the summer days. And you'll see, of course, solar doesn't produce anything before sunrise or after sunset. So its output is zero in many of the hours, both in summer and in winter. Of course, there's more solar generation in the summer than in the winter. Both the peak is higher and the hours, near the edges have more generation because the sun rises earlier and sets later in the summer. But you see that solar generation is concentrated into a relatively small number of hours. Offshore wind in the darker green here, in contrast, is a more sort of level shape across the day, but it produces less in the summer than it does in the winter. With land-based wind being similar to offshore wind, although it just produces less in each hour because it's got a lower capacity factor. A slightly different way of viewing this can be seen in the bottom right. Let's don't advance yet. In the bottom right, where we show the total monthly generation from these different types of renewables. Solar, you can see very obviously peaks in the summer and has much lower generation in the winter. Both offshore wind and land-based wind produce more in the winter hours, in the winter months, than in the summer. And the load curve, the dark blue at the top, shows that at least currently, and this is a projection for 2030, it'll still be true in 2030, electric load is generally higher in the summer, with a secondary peak in the winter and sort of dips off in the spring and fall. And that's those peaks in summer and to a lesser extent winter are driven by air conditioning load, and then some limited electrification that already exists, mostly with resistance heat in the winter. And so you can see that the different technologies have different match load in different ways. They're better in some hours and less good in other hours. Hourly prices, the market value of energy, is correlated with load. Certainly now, where we don't have a lot of renewables yet on the system, it's correlated with load. And so the market value of these different technologies is going to be related to that. And we can now step to the next page. So another way to look at this is just looking at the hour-to-hour coincidence between renewable generation and load. Here we're looking at 2030 load, which has an hourly profile that's very similar to current load. And we're comparing the hourly shape, and here we're really looking at the shape, not the totals, comparing the hourly shape of load across the year with the various types of renewable generation one at a time to understand how well the renewable generation matches hourly load. And so in the graphic on the left, we've scaled the total amount of renewable generation to equal the load profiles. You can think of this as a single megawatt hour over the load over the year that's spread out in the pattern that load now takes, or maybe it's 1,000 megawatt hours or 1,000,000 megawatt hours. The magnitude doesn't matter because we're scaling the renewable generation to meet that. And then we're netting off the two. So to say the hour by hour, what is the load in that hour versus the output of renewable generation when that renewable generation has the same total annual output, but it's got a different pattern than the load itself. And then, so we calculate net load as the difference between load in a given hour and generation from that resource in that hour. And then we do a duration curve like we've seen previously. And you see that with all the different kinds of technologies, there are a number of hours where load is higher than generation from that technology and hours when load is lower. The curves for land-based wind and offshore wind are rather similar. They're not the same because offshore wind doesn't blow at the same hours as land-based wind. But you see a really big discrepancy with solar. You see many, many hours where the solar net load is essentially equal to load, and those are the hours when it's dark outside. Solar is not producing anything, so it's not contributing to your ability to meet load in the hours when it's dark. And then, of course, in order to get enough energy over the course of the year from that solar generation, it has to produce much more in the hours when the sun is shining. And so you see here that the wind technologies in isolation are a better match for load than solar itself is, because solar is concentrated into a much smaller number of hours and mostly in the summer. But that doesn't mean that wind is necessarily more valuable than solar. Solar may nonetheless be an excellent complement to wind, in part because it does generate more in the summer, and there is a summer peak for load, and in part daily, because loads are generally higher in the daytime than they are in the evening and in the nighttime. And a blend of these two kinds of resources is likely to be better than either one in isolation. But it's important to keep in mind that at the extremes, as renewable penetration of a particular resource type increases, it can depress the market price and the market value of that resource in precisely the hours when it's producing energies. Storage, of course, can help match generation to load, but that, of course, comes at a cost. So let's jump ahead one more slide. And what we're showing here is the energy market revenue that would be generated by each of these types of resources in terms of dollars per megawatt hour. So this is the average price that each of these renewable energy types would earn. And we've looked at that. We look at that over time. The first group of bars for 2020 all the way out to 2040. And in each set of 4 bars, the rightmost bar, the dark blue, is the load weighted price. So this is essentially the average price that load pays. And the heights of the bars differ because the different renewable generation produces power in different hours and hours that have different prices. And of course, the load is consumed in a pattern that's different from any one of those renewable generation types. Something that's really interesting here is that for 2025 and 2030, you see that the market value of solar is notably less than the market value of wind. And a big part of what's driving that is the fact that, as we mentioned before, solar produces most of its energy in the summer, and wind produces most of its energy in the winter. And for the near term and medium term, where natural gas is setting the price of electricity, natural gas costs more in the winter because it's more constrained, mostly for heating. But since gas costs more in the winter, it sets electricity prices higher in the winter. And that means that the market value of wind, which produces more in the winter, so the average price that it can gain is higher than the average price that solar will gain, because solar is mostly producing in the summer. These bars take into account the hourly price over the full year, but that seasonal effect of the higher gas and therefore electricity prices in the winter is really what's dominating the difference in the market value in these resources in the next decade or so. In the longer term, you see that they even out, that the market value of offshore wind is driven down. And that's because as more and more renewables penetrate the system, wind is an economical choice for much of the build out, as we saw before. And it has this effect that we were just talking about, that as you build more of a particular kind of resource, it pushes down the market price in precisely the hours when that resource generates. And you can see that effect in the 2035 and 2040 values here. So I'm going to do a quick time check. We're at 11:15, which is good. Let's go ahead and roll into the next slide. And we'll just jump one more. So we've put together the information that Mike talked about earlier on the cost of acquiring the various types of renewable resources and how those costs can change over time. With this simulation of the market value of electricity over time, and to get an initial estimate of the ratepayer cost impacts of these of filling the gap with one or another kind of these renewable resources. And here we are looking at what we're referring to as bookend portfolios. So a portfolio that consists entirely of land-based wind, or entirely of offshore wind, or entirely of utility scale or distributed solar. Acknowledging that we'll be building sort of more sophisticated portfolios as we go forward. But here on the lower left, we show first for 25 and then for 2030, for 2025 and then for 2030, the net customer costs, accounting for the cost of acquiring a resource and then netting off the market value of that resource. So the height of the entire bar is the cost of acquiring the resource. And then if you subtract off the crosshatched portion at the top, that's the market value of that resource type in the given year. And so the top of just the solid portion of the bar is the above market cost for each of these resource types. And you see for 2025, the three large technologies seem to be between $30 and about $40 per megawatt hour of above market costs. And those above market costs decrease by 2030, primarily due to reduction, our projected reduction in the overall cost of acquiring those resources. So this is sort of the first year cost for a new resource acquired in the year that we're looking at. And when we say first year cost, we mean sort of levelizing the cost of acquiring the resource over its lifetime, approximately 20 years, but then offsetting that with the market value just in that 1 year for that resource. And of course, the market value, as we just saw on the previous slide, does change over time. So we're seeing Interestingly, so on the table on the right looks at a snapshot at 2030. For the large technologies, above market cost in the range of $25 to $30. That's 2.5 cents to 3 cents per kilowatt hour for customers. And that's the cost of the energy that we're acquiring. That's not the ratepayer cost. That doesn't yet spread the costs over all the energy that ratepayers are buying. And we also looked at the range. So the first column of the table on the right looks at the low end of the range, where costs could be significantly lower, maybe even around $10 per megawatt hour, 1 cent per kilowatt hour for acquiring this. Or on the high end of the range that we evaluated, maybe around $40 per megawatt hour, 4 cents per kilowatt hour. I've been talking mostly to this point about the large technologies. It's worth recognizing that distributed solar is also an option. It does have noticeably higher initial costs, and so therefore the ratepayer cost, when you're considering just the acquisition cost of the distributed solar and the market value of that, the remaining cost is higher than for these larger scale technologies. But this does not yet account for the local economic impact that could be particularly associated with those distributed solar resources. That is an active part of our analysis right now. We don't have results yet to show you, but we are working on that, and you'll see some of that in the next webinar and ultimately in our final report. So let's go ahead to the next slide and ask the question, sort of, what does this mean for ratepayer costs? Here we've illustrated, and this is only illustrative, but we've illustrated a strategy where the gap gets filled over the second half of the coming decade. So the gap between where you are now or where you will be after the Revolution Wind project comes on, all the way up to 100% renewable. And we have, just for purpose of this analysis, we've assumed that the additional renewables will be sort of phased in more or less uniformly over that period of time. So starting in 2025, finishing in 2030, reaching 100% renewable by 2030. And you see the alternative increment in ratepayer costs. You see the bars are increasing from left to right as we go from 2025 out to 2030. And what's really driving that, of course, is that in 2025, you won't have filled very much of the gap, but over each year, over time, you'll fill more and more of it until finally in 2030, you will have filled the entire gap. And so by the time you reach 100%, you will be at the goal. If we were to project out further to the right, further in time, those increases in ratepayer cost should stop. So they should stabilize at around 2030. And we've estimated the level for each of the different technologies here. We're not ready, we don't have final numbers here, in part because these estimates only show the costs for the additional renewables that fill the gap. What we illustrate here does not yet show the cost to Rhode Island customers of the previously acquired RECs and renewable energy, such as Revolution Wind, and we want to be able to add those in as well. So, but importantly, once you reach 100% renewable, you won't continue to increase the renewable share. It won't go beyond 100%. Even if your electric load increases over time with additional electrification of heat and transportation, that shouldn't materially increase the cost per kilowatt hour or megawatt hour of above market costs from renewables, because you'll be increasing your load at the same time you're increasing the amount of renewable generation. And in fact, you'd expect those above market costs to actually decrease a little bit over time as the renewable generation continues to get cheaper and cheaper with more experience. So this is the kind of figure that we will be able to fill in, we hope actually within a few weeks, as we finalize our analysis of the quantitative component of this project. I want to step forward and talk about the one part of the analysis that we haven't yet addressed, one part of the quantitative analysis, which is the economic impacts analysis. And maybe we can jump to the next slide, Ellen. Thank you. This analysis is in process. We don't have any draft results yet, but we will be able to characterize for each of the different technologies, and we'll need to specify the extent to which those various technologies might be implemented on a more local basis versus being purchased from outside. So for instance, with distributed solar, you would expect, and you'd be right, that there's a lot of the expenditures for distributed solar are actually expended within the state. They create jobs within the state. They create economic activity within the state, and those factors benefit the state. At the bottom here, there's just an example from a prior study that we did in 2017 with Rhode Island, an example of what the results of that might look like. But we will specify the construction spending that goes along with a given portfolio of renewable, the impact that has on electricity prices, so the ratepayer impact, as well as the administrative costs of developing this portfolio. And then be able to look at the economic impact on the state in terms of GDP, overall economic output, and as well as labor income and employment, numbers of jobs. So you would expect that a distributed solar strategy will result in greater local economic impacts within Rhode Island than a strategy of purchasing land-based wind from New York, just as an example. And we'll be able to compare the direct ratepayer impacts of those alternative strategies and also take into account this economic impact on GDP, number of jobs, and labor income. So I think that brings us close to the end of sort of the material that I prepared. And so maybe we can jump one slide forward and say where we're going next in analyzing these renewable portfolios. I just talked through the economic impact analysis that we will be doing. And we'll also be able to look at the impacts of net metering and virtual net metering and the cost shifts that those imply from participating ratepayers to non-participating ratepayers. And of course, the next important thing is going to be able to say, let's get away from these bookend portfolios and to develop some slightly more sophisticated portfolios that look at combinations of resource types. Maybe a combination of some distributed solar, perhaps some utility scale solar with some offshore wind. And how does a portfolio of those resources compare on all these metrics that we are developing here? And of course, we won't be able to look at all possible combinations of different resource types, but we should be able to quickly find some types that look good on some particular dimensions and be able to lay out the range of possibilities that you could pursue a strategy of this resource mix, which has some advantages perhaps in ratepayer costs. An alternative mix may have some advantages in terms of local economic impacts. And then it will be up to policymakers to decide among those different alternatives and facing those trade-offs, what is the best strategy for Rhode Island to pursue. We'll also be able to look at the environmental impacts of these various portfolios, the greenhouse gas emissions implications. Although, as we've already mentioned, this should be similar for all the portfolios because they all achieve 100% renewable energy, and therefore they all offset similar amounts of fossil generation by 2030. Certainly reduce Rhode Island's greenhouse gas impacts from the electric sector to effectively zero by 2030. And then we also want to consider some more qualitative factors as well. These are no less important. They may be harder to quantify in the terms that we've been talking about so far, but the impacts on land use and equity and impacts on vulnerable populations and groups of ratepayers. We want to be able to factor those considerations in as well. That'll give us a basis for analyzing the various alternative resource portfolios that we have developed and we will develop. And then we want to move on into the final really big phase of the project. So if we can jump ahead a slide or two, to developing some policy recommendations based on what we will have learned by that time by looking at these different portfolios and the impacts of those. We want to develop some policy recommendations to consider different alternative procurement mechanisms for achieving a particular desired mix of renewable generation. So what are the different mechanisms that are available, the different renewable energy programs? Rhode Island already has some of them. Those could be expanded or they could be complemented with additional programs. Alternatively, some procurements, some resource procurements like Revolution Wind. Do we want to do another procurement of a large offshore wind or land-based wind chunk of renewable energy? And one of the things that we want to consider is the ability to create competition between different resource types. It may be difficult for them to compete directly, since if you hold a solicitation to procure 400 megawatts worth of generation, which might be a terawatt hour or almost 2 terawatt hours of generation, it might be difficult to have both a 400 megawatt offshore wind facility and a bunch of very small or much smaller utility scale or even distributed solar resources competing directly with one another within a given solicitation. Nonetheless, they should at least inform one another. Rhode Island already knows and will know more as it goes forward about the price that it's paying via particular programs or procurement efforts for alternative resource types for renewable energy. And it can establish, for instance, reservation price in auctions. If experience has shown that the wind power can be acquired at a given price and you're trying to minimize the cost when you're acquiring solar, your best alternative in other technologies can play into that. And taking into account both the cost of acquiring the resource and the market value of those resources. And so even without having the resources necessarily compete directly in the same program or the same procurement solicitation, you can learn from one to the other to use your best information to keep costs down for ratepayers. the state is likely to learn over time. We have developed some projections of how costs may decline over time. It's unlikely that those cost declines will be followed exactly. And even within a few years, we may deviate substantially from those. Certainly over the past few years, people across New England have been surprised at the prices at which renewable energy is available. And I don't by any means think that those surprises won't occur in the future. The state needs to be able to revise its procurement targets and mechanisms, learning from its own procurements and procurements done in other states in the region, and perhaps coordinating with other states for that as well. It's important to keep in mind that uncertainty in load means that there's uncertainty in the total quantity of renewable resources that you'll need in order to hit 100%. It'd be difficult to plan to hit 100% exactly, and any unexpected gap could be filled with by purchasing New England RECs off the market. As we saw earlier, the need for additional renewable energy is likely to increase, and significantly so, even beyond 2030. And so it's a moving target even beyond 2030 to even stay at 100%. So this problem, it's not like 2030 provides a final target that one needs to hit. It's a moving target even beyond that. And will require additional renewable procurements or resources over time, even beyond that. So certainly now we are thinking in terms of a primary policy change would be to raise the renewable energy, the RES share target to 100% by 2030. And of course that by itself won't be enough. Other approaches will also be needed. We do foresee a need to change the treatment of behind the meter resources, ones that earn RECs, because there's a potential under the existing system for double counting of the renewable value of those resources, and especially with the program to dramatically increase the amount of renewable energy by 2030, you don't want that to create an opportunity for that sort of double counting to expand. But that's sort of a preview of where we're going next with the project, and we look forward to talking to you again, likely in November at the third of these workshops. So I'm going to pause now. I think we've got another poll question up next. If we can just jump to the next. And this is an open-ended question, and we hope to get input from a lot of people here, and also by email following the webinar. If you see an opportunity to respond in a little more detail by email, we would appreciate that. But we'd like to just get a sense of, are there policies that you believe would be particularly beneficial, policy approaches to acquiring these renewable resources? Or alternatively, are there policies that we should avoid in pushing forward with this goal? So I think at this point, this poll, we won't see any results on screen because that's sort of an open-ended thing, and people will be submitting comments to us. But perhaps at this point we should open it to Q&A, and while we're doing the Q&A, people can respond to the poll, and hopefully we'll have an opportunity to answer a few questions that may have been raised in the last little while I've been talking.
That sounds great. Thanks again to everyone who has continued to submit their questions through the Q&A feature. We will do our best to respond in writing to as many questions as we can. And again, we welcome your continued questions and comments to our email address, energy.resources@energy.ri.gov. We have 2 questions that we'd like to pose to the Brattle team for this Q&A session. The first one, we've had a series of questions related to the regional nature of our electric grid. I'm wondering if the Brattle team could please elaborate on how policies from neighboring states have been incorporated into this analysis.
Okay, that's a really good question. And I presume that these questions are focused toward our characterization of the New England market using our GridSim model. And so what we have done with GridSim is to project forward sort of the existing policies of other states, of Rhode Island as well, but of other states, both in terms of their RPS programs, their Renewable Portfolio programs, what are their RPS targets, how do they evolve over time, and how do they require additional renewable resources, and also incorporating announced procurements that some other states have done in similar way to Rhode Island has done. Some other New England states are actually procuring resources in advance of their renewable energy standard or their RPS programs. So we have incorporated those, and we've also incorporated longer term carbon constraints in our model, so that the electric system needs to decarbonize on a trajectory toward 2050 to ultimately effectively decarbonize the electricity sector, as well as to accommodate the electrification of other sectors. Now, we absolutely understand that the policies that will drive the electrification of other sectors, both in Rhode Island and in other New England states, have yet to be fully developed. We are projecting a future in which New England overall will achieve its 80% greenhouse gas reductions by 2050 across the economies of the 6 New England states. And that'll require significant amounts of electrification of the heating sector and the transport sector. So we get to certainly by the, in 2 or 3 decades, we get to an electric system that is meeting much more load because of this electrification, and it's doing it with a much greater share of renewable generation, and yet still keeping enough dispatchable generation and or storage around in order to ensure system reliability. Jürgen, Mike, would you like to add anything further to that? All right. I guess that was a good answer.
Don't think so. Yeah, no, it's I mean, was it the Yogi Berra quote about forecasting the future being hard as opposed to just forecasting? I mean, it's true that especially, I don't know how much room there still is. We had the discussion before the webinar between 2020 and 2030 for policies in other New England states to change. Or, I saw some of the questions, federal policies might change, who knows, that have an impact on the backdrop against which we sort of model how Rhode Island might sort of get to 100%. And then obviously that gets much harder, even much harder in some ways after 2030, where, the region has broad decarbonization goals, but how each of these states is going to implement those and what impact that has on the evolution of the New England electric grid is just it's a complicated thing. And I don't want to sort of get a cheap out here, but so policy has to recognize that some of the stuff is uncertain, and so we can do our best to sort of A, estimate what might happen in the rest of the region, and B, develop policy approaches that are robust and flexible to things happening in the rest of the region. So I think those are kind of policy design kind of elements that we're aware that this happens within the broader context of New England, and therefore policies implemented by Rhode Island have to in some sense, fit and recognize the impact of the policies elsewhere. But it remains uncertain, is the basic story. I want to answer the grid one, even though we shouldn't answer it. So there are lots of questions. I'll do that. So there are lots of questions that are basically related to interconnection costs, siting issues, even the 4600 docket questions in some sense. They have to do with the network piece of it as opposed to with the resources. And you know, I'm going to play the role of saying it's hard today, but I think it. You know, it's not in our scope in some ways to figure out what the optimal evolution is of the Rhode Island grid or the New England grid. Figuring that out by itself is really hard, and then implementing that optimal grid expansion would be even harder. I think it's just fair to recognize that evaluating the role that the connecting infrastructure, i.e. the transmission and distribution wires, have for making certain types of renewable resources placed in various parts of the grid more or less expensive it's just a tremendously complicated exercise. And so we have to make pretty broad assumptions about how expensive it is to interconnect, say, you know, a distributed solar resource here versus an offshore wind resource there. But I certainly think outside of this project, and this is now more a personal opinion, I suppose, outside of this particular project, Rhode Island and the region and the country and probably the world has to pay a lot more attention to facilitating an evolution of the grid in a way that allows a relatively rapid transition from the current energy system to one that's much more heavily and perhaps entirely dependent on various types of renewables. It's a real important challenge that's, you know, in some sense a different and related problem to the one we're trying to solve in this project, and that the executive order in some sense addresses. I don't know whether that is an answer to the various questions about that, but you know, yeah, it would be great to have more coordinated efforts. You know, it would be great to think about making siting possible and easier. It would be great to create a faster expansion of the transmission grid in New England to allow various resources to connect. That would be great. Unfortunately, the mechanism is in place. And the responsibilities for adding grid infrastructure are very decentralized, and so there are some barriers that have to be overcome. But you know, but the issue is an important one and should be on top of everybody's mind as we think about how to accomplish the decarbonization of the grid.
Thanks, Jürgen.
Yeah.
I've got one last question for the Brattle team, and this has to relate back to our heating sector transformation work. For the audience, the Brattle team was also our consultant for our heat sector transformation analysis. All of those materials can be found on OER's webpage. And the question for the team is, how does the 100% renewable electricity analysis relate back to the heating sector transformation analysis? Specifically, are there any findings from the heat sector transformation analysis that are used as inputs for this work? Or would the findings from the 100% analysis change any of the insights from the heating sector transformation work?
Thanks, Carrie. Yeah, this is an excellent question, and at a high level, they are very much linked, and they are linked through this. What for the purpose of this study is essentially an assumption, but I think it's validated by what we found in the heat sector work, that there is likely to be a large-scale electrification of the heat sector. That in order to decarbonize the heat sector, one of the primary approaches, one of the primary promising approaches, is electrification with heat pumps. And in that study, we looked at air source versus ground source heat pumps. We have here not delved into the question of whether the electrification of heat in Rhode Island will be via air source or ground source. In part, this is because Rhode Island is, again, a small part of the New England grid, and what happens in other states will have at least as much impact on the electricity grid as what happens in Rhode Island. But the really fundamental thing here that we've accounted for is that yes, there is likely to be a lot of electrification of other sectors, not just the heat sector, but importantly in the heat sector, and that'll increase load. Probably not a lot by 2030, but almost certainly a lot after 2030. And that's a big contributor to our observation that by the time you get to 100%, you're not finished. Just staying at 100% as electric load grows over time with more electrification will itself be a challenge.
Thank you. At this point, I'd like to hand it over to Commissioner Uchi for some closing slides.
Great. Ellen, if we can advance. Great. So we're going to post these slides, as we mentioned, on our website, and we've included, I think, a living glossary in our slide decks. I really appreciate the Brattle team pulling that together. We acknowledge, as we did up front, that our attendees have varying degrees of understanding and knowledge in the energy system, which may be the most complex machine in the world. So we're doing our best to try to provide some background. But I encourage folks to shoot OER an email. We'll put that address up on the slide in a moment. If you have just background questions and if there's something you think we can help explain, we welcome your comments and we'll do our best to respond. After this workshop closes, we're going to send a survey to all attendees. We encourage you to respond to that. The last workshop in which we did this, the responses were very insightful, and I encourage you all to do it again. Next slide. Oh, this is easy. Thank you. Here's our website. Oh, my 5-year-old also wants to thank all of you for joining. Here's our website and our email address. Again, really appreciate your time and attention today. Your contributions in the Q&A. It gives us a lot to chew on in our meetings with Brattle and our project team. We are continuously trying to improve how we're approaching this project. It is massive, and as I think Jürgen eloquently stated, there are more variables than we can account for, and because the energy system is uncertain 5 weeks from now, let alone 5, 10, 15 years from now. But I hope that folks can appreciate that we are doing everything we can to try and answer as many questions as we can through this study, knowing though that whatever our answers will be or the policy pathways that we develop, technology is evolving. We will need flexibility to adjust on the fly to achieve our long-term energy and environmental goals. And that's true for Rhode Island. It's also true for the rest of the states in the region. So with that, I think we will call it. And again, thank you so much for being in attendance today.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
So, Carrie and Ellen, will we keep this open for a little while to allow us to respond to the last few Q&As?
Yeah, let's try to keep it open for another 10 minutes and so we can try to get through this.
Okay, great. Thank you all.
Thanks.